Welcome to Keith Knight Don't Tread on Anyone and the Libertarian Institute. Today I have Joe Solis-Mullen, my colleague at the Institute, to discuss his book, Classical Liberalism, The Birth and Death of an Idea. Joe, where is the best place for people to purchase this book?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, Keith. And I always tell people go to the Libertarian Institute's website, click on books, because there you can find a link to my most recent book, which Keith just alluded to, as well as my two other books, as well as all of the other fantastic books that the Institute has put out. So clicking to that takes you directly to the Amazon sale page. You'll get to read editorial reviews, customer reviews, all that great stuff. So
You use three metrics to explain why liberalism is unique: universalized rights, delegitimized unlimited sovereignty, and the sanctification of property and contract. Let's go through each one of those. Talk to me about the benefits of why people should care about these things, and I'll try to push back a little on each one. They universalized rights. Rights did not belong merely to Christians or citizens, but to all humans as rational beings. Why are universalized rights important?
Well, this was a product of the Enlightenment, of course, and this was something that Mises thought was very important. And a lot of people have pointed to the fact that rights, emerge out of highly localized contexts, right? And so this idea of the universalization of rights was something that was built on natural law theory and sort of the Christian scholastics that people like Rothbard talk extensively about in his History of Economic Thought. So it was an interesting idea. It wasn't necessarily uh, it wasn't a necessary condition for liberalism to arise, but with the Enlightenment and this idea that all beings are rational and self-governing, the idea became all human beings are endowed with these rights. These are universal rights, whether or not you live in a polity that recognizes those rights or not. So that
When
was
it
that was very interesting development. Um, yes.
when it comes to the concept of rationality, I think it is often strawmanned against us when we say humans are rational, as in, oh, you think everyone has perfect information and therefore we don't need the existence of a state. But no, people are fallible. In fact, they make many common errors. And if you just change the price of a wine and give it different marketing, but it's the same wine, people will say the price of your wine tastes better. That's how fallible people are. Therefore, we need a regulatory state. What do you mean when you say rationality?
Right, that's a great point. There's a whole sub school of economics now that's grown out of this very obvious observation that human beings can be gamed a little bit, behavioral economics, uh, which I don't even necessarily dislike some of their work, but it is obviously, as you said, often taken as, well, see, here's why we need a specific type of regulatory state. So when I say rational, I mean specifically in the context of the Enlightenment. I mean that they believe that human beings, by using their limited reason, we weren't yet at the point of sort of the later progressives who believed that human beings could be perfected. No, they recognized that reason was limited, but they also recognized that human beings were capable of choosing rational ends and generally pursuing rational means to achieve those ends, which is very in line with Mises, of course. And so that's all they meant. They didn't mean to suggest that people had perfect information. These were still, for the most part, Christians who believed that human beings were fallible, that they were limited, that they were not endowed with perfect information. Um, but they also believed that whatever failures might occur because of a lack of information or what have you, it was far preferable to having a government powerful enough to dictate to the people.
I'm reading this book. It's called Subliminal. I or no, it's about the subconscious mind, and that's his whole thing. Is that science shows that economics has been totally wrong and basically useless on this idea. Joe, I hope you're sitting down. You're going to be shocked to hear this. He says humans are irrational, and then doesn't take that criticism and apply it to politicians who I guess would be fully rational, have no self-interest of their own, have
Supermen.
no, poor impulse control or anything. He says people are fallible and then just takes that criticism and applies it to market actors. What I love about the great classical liberal Ludwig von Mises is he said humans act and humans seek to gain profit, whether it's psychic profit or monetary profit. This is totally different than what we see today, where it's like people in the capitalist private sector look for profit. Other people, President Trump, what he does is he looks out for us. He protects us from the Ayatollah. Bernie Sanders protects us from the greed on Wall Street. So we have a lot of selfless actors out there. Whereas Mises said, no, no, when I say humans, I'm referring to all humans. Again, it's this consistency which classical liberalism brought to the forefront, which is still underappreciated to this day. One other thing about rationality. Okay, so it's not saying that people have perfect information, as the people who strawman us like to say. Is it simply the claim that when people engage in actions, they're using some sort of cost benefit analysis that needs to be taken into account before we justify the state stepping in as someone as a sovereign to coercively control them? Is there anything else on rationality that people should understand?
Well, the idea of the original liberalism, which we now call classical liberalism, was that the state would have nothing to do with regulating the economic and social life of a people, that it would be strictly confined to protecting the lives, liberty, and property of persons and protecting them specifically from the predations of the state. So, if there was something going on where someone was, doing something that their neighbors, that their society, we have to remember where this is coming from, right? This is a product of really a pre-industrial, early industrial economy. It's largely rural, it's largely local, it's largely village. It's extremely uh uh what's the word I'm looking for? Uh a lot of like associations, like the civic society was much thicker. People were parts of lots of different organizations and communities, and that the idea was, look, if they're doing something within their town that people find objectionable, that look, that's where people can uh, you know uh, apply religious pressure, or like, agree that they're not going to shop at that person's business or something, but that it was no business of the state at all, and that it was highly dangerous and undesirable to say, hey, that person's doing something that we don't like, let's make it illegal. That was where they drew the line. It wasn't that there was nothing objectionable, right? Like the whole idea of liberalism has its a prioris, right? That like that to have things to barter and freely exchange is good because that makes more for everyone. Like, you have to accept certain premises that, like, yes, it is good to create more things so that more people can suffer less and repopulate and stuff. So they recognize that some behavior is antithetical to that and needs to be stopped. Otherwise, you can't have society. And this wasn't, some kind of like insight just from liberals. This was, in Plato's Republic, they talk about that. Um, but the idea was that, look, if they're not violating the property rights of someone else or the person of someone else, then the state has no business there. So
Got it. Okay. So the reason that this comes up frequently is people will always jump to rationality or say there's no explanation that I can think of, therefore the state's legitimate. For example, if they say, well, people are working in poor conditions in third world countries, no one wants that. So there must either be a conspiracy, it must be the terrible capitalist system, it must be that they're being exploited. Whereas the Austrian economists would say, well, what they're doing is making a rational calculation based on their available options, and that is their best option. In the realm of foreign policy, we see it all the time. Putin's crazy. He can't be negotiated with. Bin Ladenites are crazy. They can't be negotiated with. Gaddafi is just killing his own people. Assad is just gassing his own people. Hitler was crazy, not rational, just wanted to take over the world. These people can't be negotiated with. So, this concept of universal rights, both in the importance of not being aggressed against and the duty of not aggressing against others, I think is important when it comes to the concept of rationality, because while some people will say, well, they disagree with it because it's not about because people don't have perfect information. Once you stamp that out, you still have to address the fact that so many people act in politics as though there's no rationality. I talk to socialists all the time who cannot think of a single reason why someone would want a job working for an employer. They say, well, everyone would want to, be part of a workplace democracy. It's in everyone's interest. Really? Going to meetings all the time, talking about all these things that you know very little about, that's in their rational interest? It very well could be that it's not in their interest at all. Thank heavens the printer and microphone I used weren't, done by Democratic Assembly and me getting just as much of a say as all the engineers.
Yeah.
That was the process of competition. When it comes to they delegitimized unlimited sovereignty. Monarchs could sin against the law of nature and thereby lose their authority. Why is this important?
This is a good one. So, in many ways, it was returning to the more bounded monarchy of feudal Europe. People tend to kind of compress this idea of monarchy into like this one highly specific period. And I'm talking 16th and 17th century in places like France, where they were building absolutist monarchies, which was where they were taking away all the power from all the intermediating institutions, professionalizing a bureaucracy and a tax state, and centralizing control, right? So, this is what the liberals are rejecting, that the king is above the laws, that the king is the state. This was a relatively new idea. This idea of like the divine right of kings and centralized rule and unlimited tax power and stuff like this was all a very new innovation. Again, really just those couple hundred years. Previously, European kings had been tremendously weak. They had had to rely on bartering with their powerful nobles and church leaders over everything. And so, really, they were just insisting on what had been the norm, that leaders were not all powerful, that they were bound by the law. This was, of course, part of what was at stake during the English Revolution that resulted in Charles losing his head. Was Parliament was saying the king is subject to the laws, and he was saying, no, I'm not. I'm above the law, which was what the French kings had asserted. So, yeah, the liberals were really just calling on what had long been established European tradition, which had really just been subverted in the previous couple of centuries by monarchies who were trying to really increase the war making capacity of their states by getting rid of intermediating institutions, consolidating tax power, professionalizing a bureaucracy. And it was all in order to more effectively extract resources from their territory in order to use those to do more effective war making on their neighbors, because this was a time when war was becoming very expensive. Your nobles were no longer useful for fighting wars. They were obsolete. Now you needed large standing armies of guys who fought with, gunpowder weapons, and you needed heavy capital ships. So the needs of the monarchy had adapted, and so that's really where that process grew out of.
In the Declaration of Independence, it says a number of things, and then it says that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So when I read that, that is much closer to the concept of anarchism or voluntarism than anything that would justify statism. Because if you, politicians, derive your powers from the consent of me, that implies I can give consent to things I'm entitled to, and I can only delegate rights to you that I first have. But if I don't have the right to declare war, the right to tax anyone, if I don't have the right to issue regulations unilaterally, if I don't have the right to conscript, if I don't have the right to take out debt on behalf of other people, both living and unborn, well, then this appears to not be some relationship where I'm delegating rights to you. This seems much more of a rulership. So, do you think that we've basically gone astray from the Declaration of Independence in granting the states a monopoly on rights that no one else has or ever had delegated to them in the first place?
Oh, certainly so. I mean, I can't imagine what someone like Thomas Jefferson would think if he were brought here now and we basically sat him down and explained the powers of the government now. I don't even know how he would respond. I mean, he'd be horrified, he'd be shocked. Uh, probably after seeing how things developed, he would realize that, oh, the Constitution was really a huge death blow there, because it was just a matter of time before power. It's of course Murray Rothbard's birthday today, so of course we have to mention his phenomenal "Conceived in Liberty," which shows how the Constitution was actually really a betrayal of the principles of the Revolution, which were very Lockean, which were very anarchical. And the Articles of Confederation were really a realization of that project. But it was the centralizing nationalists who said, no, we got to get rid of those and get a powerful central government that can make war, that can demand taxes, not ask for voluntary contributions, but can demand them, and exercise the power to regulate commerce and issue standard regulations and all of that stuff. So it was, people should read that if they haven't. But yes, absolutely. If you look at Rothbard's Conceived in Liberty, he does a great job of showing the intellectual origins of the revolution. He goes all the way back to the chartering of the colonies and whatnot. But yes, absolutely. The government today bears no relationship at all to what someone like Thomas Jefferson had in mind, drawing on the principles of Locke and the very, very limited government that they had in mind.
I think one of the benefits of classical liberalism uh, has that I guess I don't know if people would identify themselves as monarchists, but anyone who advocates the ideas of like Curtis Yarvin or says that look, well, we have too many competing ideas in this society. We just need one person with unilateral authority to at least get stuff done because Congress isn't deadlock. We can't get any success on anything. We just need a um, well, what is the term that Yarvin uses? A powerful executive where all the authority is centralized, just like a chief executive officer of Apple. We need a CEO of the government to really get things done instead of having to go through all these hoops with people who don't know what they're talking about. I think one of the important things liberalism brings to the table is the next point you have, which is they sanctified property and contract. So instead of a monarch who has the right to collect money involuntarily, the classical liberal position is people can gain a great deal of power in the voluntary sector if they respect these bounds, if they stay on the field and don't go out of bounds. And out of bounds would be disrespecting property rights or the right to contract. So it seems like people advocating monarchy or statism really basically don't appreciate the incentives created, how people can change when the incentives change. So if I'm a really good guy producing a great product or service, and then I have the right to issue taxes and regulations and protectionist policies, well, then the change in my incentives is going to change my behavior. Now I'm no longer on my heels trying to please consumers. So I think the dedication to incentives with property and contract is an important distinction that a lot of people are not appreciating, both the Bernie Sanders and the Curtis Yarvinses of the world. Do you think classical liberalism's focus on incentives and how the same person under different incentives can respond differently, is that a uniquely beneficial aspect to liberalism?
Well, I think that was an insight that classical liberals had, in which they incorporated very well. And of course, there's a whole theory of class conflict that liberalism produced that showed that it's really the productive classes of society that are engaged in free exchange and commerce and meeting the demands of consumers. And then there's that class of those who produce nothing and who live off of regulating them. And so, yes, and there is certainly a problem, right? Acton recognized this problem, one of the great classical liberals, who recognized that, look, if you put someone in a position of power, it's going to change their behavior, especially if they're not accountable to any kind of consumer market, which is highly sensitive to competition, right? Because that's the key. There's no competition with the US government. There's no other government that you can vote for. You can't opt out of this one. You have this one. And really, we're in a state of incredible path determinacy right now. Like, so many uh, consequential decisions have been made. So much of a state apparatus has been built up that even if you elect someone, say like a Donald Trump, who says that he's against the state and against all the decisions and wants to do this and that, like, the machinery of government is moving with such tremendous power and force and momentum in that direction that no single person, even if they are the president, is going to really be able to stop it. And they're looking out for themselves, just like, and that's not specific to Donald Trump. That's Joe Biden. That's Barack Obama. That's all of them. They are there to get elected and to serve their party. So it's very difficult for classical liberals, because we're, of course, virtually without any kind of representation, which of course raises all sorts of questions uh, in terms of the legitimacy of the political process, right? Like, I have never consented. No person who I've ever voted for has won an office, right? So what does it mean? Like, democracy has become entirely procedural, and that's a huge problem, because when de Tocqueville wrote about democracy in America, he wasn't talking about the fact that people show up once every 2 years or every 4 years and vote. He was talking about the vibrant, lived democracy of communities where everyone just got together and figured things out for themselves and took care of things and made decisions. That's what he was talking about. He was marveling at the incredibly robust civic societies and self help societies where people actively took part in helping each other. And what he had projected, which Ralph Raico wrote about, was that eventually citizens would grow lazy, because democracy of the kind that he was speaking about is hard work. It takes responsibility and energy, and they would eventually just abdicate all these responsibilities to an increasingly large state and a bureaucracy that would take care of those needs, called a soft despotism. Um, there's actually a class now down at Hillsdale College on de Tocqueville and soft despotism, which
Yeah, I think the point about selfishness is also important, that people make decisions with regard to their own self-interest, because I don't know, but I'm trying to get into the head of our opposition here. I quite literally believe that they think there are non-selfish actors in the world. The way I try to prove this in my book, Domestic Imperialism, is I try to ask people, how can we explain the fact that places like YouTube and Netflix have recorded billions of hours of videos watched by millions and hundreds of millions of people, and those people sit there and watch the Netflix knowing that they could be out building houses for the homeless, they could be feeding the needy, they could donate blood once every 8 weeks, and instead, they'll sometimes rest or relax or converse, or they'll spend money at a restaurant knowing they could eat rice and beans and take that money and give it to the starving children of Malawi, or maybe a homeless person in a local city. The other example I use is compare how upset people get to the loss of one person in their life, say one mother, one of their friends, and compare it to how devastated they are hearing about the 100,000 deaths in the Franco Prussian War. You would think, because they're not selfish, they would get 100,000 times as sad when gave them this information that 100,000 people died. I've never had someone break down and cry and say, 100,000. Oh my gosh. They go into a state of depression. They need therapy for years. They can't leave their house. Well, actually, no one's ever like, even they're like, Franco, I've never heard of that. When was that one again? I've only heard of Vietnam and the Second World War. I didn't know there were any wars before that one. So this understanding of selfishness and the human condition, and extending it consistently to the political realm, I think is another great contribution to liberalism. Another great contribution of liberalism to the political arena. Anything else on on that?
Oh, yeah, I didn't know if you were
Um,
about to say something else. No, I think what liberalism recognized was that people are naturally self-interested, and that you should gear the incentive architecture that they face towards allowing that natural self-interest to promote the common good. And the common good isn't like a real thing. Like, it's, I can't point to the common good. We can just say that there are certain social arrangements that will produce less violence and more wealth than others. And liberalism just said, hey, instead of trying to act like people are angels and that we can hand power to some of them, and that that's going to somehow make them look out for everyone and make better things. No, no, right? Adam Smith and all the French physiocrats before him had said, look, what we really want is to just unleash the power of individuals. They will pursue their own self interest. And by allowing them to pursue their self interest within very narrow bounds, that is, respecting the property and lives of others, they will produce things that are geared toward the wants and needs of others. Out of pure self interest, they will be trying to serve others, not because they care about others, like maybe they do, but that's the beauty of it, is it doesn't matter. In a capitalist or anarcho-capitalist, whatever, in the liberal society, like, it doesn't matter whether or not someone cares about other people, as long as they are trying to serve them in order to create wealth for themselves. And so that I think is the beauty of liberalism, is that it recognizes there's a devil in everyone, and that the best way to still create a great society out of that, a wonderful society out of that, is to put them in an incentive structure where the only way that they can thrive and get things for themselves which they want is by serving their fellows.
that is such a vitally important lesson. Thank you. What was the most important thing you learned from the works of Ralph Raico?
Oh golly. So I don't even know where to begin. I love Ralph Raico. Obviously, my fellowship is named after him. Uh, Gosh, I don't even know. Well, I'll say this. I'll say this. So, because I hadn't encountered this until I had read Raico, and that was because I hadn't read this particular book of Hayek's, which is what Hayek was his doctoral advisor. He had written this book, Capitalism and the Historians, where he shows that these blue book commissions that were created to look into the conditions of the newly industrializing cities and factories, that these were essentially put together by the House of Lords, none of whom were industrialists, all of whom were essentially anti-industrialist landowners who were essentially reactionaries against the new capitalist society and hated it and wanted to do anything they could to discredit it. And so a lot of what people take to be like gospel about like how things were, people from Dickens to Marx right down the line, was just mostly pure propaganda put together by the political enemies of capitalism among the British upper class, which is just blew my mind. Yeah. So, and then obviously I learned a lot about like the history of German liberalism from Raico, which is something I actually wrote an article this year for the Journal of Libertarian Studies about it. But yeah, German liberalism is just a very, very neglected subject. Most people who are interested in it are very familiar, of course, with English liberalism, American liberalism, French liberalism, Spanish liberalism, but German liberalism is, hardly mentioned. And so that was really critical. uh, information. And like I said, I wrote an article about it this year. Um, yeah, I would strongly recommend to anyone who is interested. The Mises Institute put out a great little book of his called "The World at War," which is actually a transcribed and annotated speech that he gave at the Cato Institute way back in the 1980s, which is basically a revisionist account of World Wars One and Two. That's really great. And then the Mises Institute put out a series of recordings by him that are from like I think like 20 years ago, if my memory serves me correctly. But it's called "The Struggle for Liberty," which is really great, where he kind of talks about the origins of liberalism and liberalism's fall and its enemies and whatnot. And he does a lot of great stuff there. So if people aren't familiar with those works, I'd definitely strongly recommend taking a look at that.
What do you think is the most misunderstood aspect of what liberalism is?
Oh, I think it's high, it's captured perfectly by that introductory paragraph in Mises's liberalism. Yeah. So in 1953, in an Atlantic article, U.S. Senator Joseph S. Clark Jr. described modern liberalism in America with these words: "A liberal is one who believes in utilizing the full force of government for the advancement of social, political, and economic justice. A liberal believes government is a proper tool to use in the development of a society, who attempts to carry Christian principles of conduct into practical effect." This is the biggest problem, is whenever I say liberal, and the origins of this particular book came from the fact that last last spring I got assigned to teach a history of Western political thought, which I had not taught before. The guy who taught it previously had retired. He's a great guy, but I was like, cool, absolutely great. And then I was trying to explain liberalism and how great liberalism was. And I teach at like a pretty conservative school, and they were all kind of like, I don't think so. And I was like, no, it's actually really great. And I wound up having to try and talk them through the rise of classical liberalism and its very quick co-option by those who basically wanted to seize on its ethos because it was associated with progress and wealth and all good things. But that by the middle of the 19th century, thanks to people like John Stuart Mill, liberalism was in the process of being turned into the exact opposite of what it had been originally. So the biggest challenge that I feel liberals face is really, like Raico said, reclaiming that word, which has been so damaged and lost, especially in the United States. If you go to some place like England, they actually still use liberal in like its proper context, but that's pretty much it. So that's the biggest thing is for students and stuff. They immediately think they associate liberalism with progressive liberalism because there was classical liberalism, which had its origins in the 1700s, in the 18th century, but that by certainly the middle, at the very latest, by the middle of the 19th century, you had a mutated form of liberalism that was just horrible. That was just horrible, that I just call progressive liberalism. And that's where you kind of fork it and you say, okay, we have two liberalisms. We have classical liberalism and progressive liberalism. Classical liberalism is the heir of liberalism, the original. And, here in the United States, of course, we tend to call actual classical liberalism, we call anarcho capitalism. So that's the true heir to that tradition. Uh, but it's really unfortunate. And in the book, I talk about how that co-option of that word took place, and yeah, it's just wild that it means now the exact opposite, like literally the exact opposite. Originally, it was the government shouldn't have anything to do with regulating the economic and social lives of its people, should only protect property and life, to now it's no, a good liberal believes that it is the government's that the government is the perfect tool for engineering desired social and economic outcomes. And it's like, wow. So that for me
Yeah,
is the biggest
the
challenge.
yeah, people who can, whatever. controlling the printing press equivalent is today. People who control the TVs, control the social media, they can really define things. A few weeks ago, America First meant no unnecessary wars of aggression. And as I've recently discovered in the last 3 days, America First means regime change in Iran. So that words are getting redefined in the present
Yeah.
as we speak. I spoke with a John Stuart Mill supporter. I have not read On Liberty, which it's a thin book. I have no excuse to have not read it. But his analysis of the situation was that um, let me try and steelman this. He goes, so much of our everyday life is spent with private voluntary institutions. So if these institutions gain so much ground, they can become just as, if not more, tyrannical than a state apparatus. So I had to ask him, so let's say there's a bill tomorrow put forth in Congress that would allow Walmart and Amazon to start, taxing people's incomes. I mean, it'd be no different than what we have now, since basically, Amazon and Walmart are just as powerful as the state. And then, companies like Blockbuster would have the right to take out debt on behalf of other people without their consent. So Blockbuster would come back into business. It never would have gone out. We should just take all the things the state has a right to and extend it to all these corporations, since they're, already as powerful as the state. And immediately, I mean, just imagine the supermarket now doesn't have to get your money voluntarily. They can tax it out of your income. You think that's going to change the quality and service that you actually get? How did this redefinition come about? Is it the people inspired by Mill? Is it the gentleman you just quoted? How did this scam take place?
Well, so Mill was concerned with what he called the tyranny of popular opinion. So, and Ralph Raico writes a great chapter on John Stuart Mill and kind of psychoanalyzes him a little bit. But so he becomes concerned with, as I said, it wasn't as though originally there wouldn't be people who felt like my lifestyle is being frowned upon, that I'm being judged by my community, and I don't like that. And they won't sell something to me from their shop because they disagree with me about, I don't know, polygamy. I don't know, whatever it is. They won't sell to me because I'm a polygamist, whatever. Well, John Stuart Mill believed that that was just intolerable, that people should be protected not only from encroachments on their persons by the state, but that their feelings, their path to self actualization, the ability to do and say whatever they want, should not only be protected from the state, but also from all of their fellows. So this idea is that now the state needs to protect people from opinions they don't like. And I think it's a very short jump to see where we go from there. The state's going to need to regulate speech, right? Because I might say something that is offensive to you. And it really it sounds so like, and again, as you're reading On Liberty, if you're not on the lookout for it, which admittedly the first time I read On Liberty was, I don't know, I was like a sophomore or something, like I didn't grasp the importance of that idea and tie it to like, okay, wait a second, if the state is going to protect you from unpopular opinions, and he doesn't say it exactly like that, but that's like the obvious only way that that could be construed as you try and think through like what does it mean to protect you from the unfavorable opinions of others. Well, the only way to do that, unless someone from the government's going to walk around behind you and just put their hands over their ears, is to make it so they can't say those things to you. And I just look at all of the incredible and I don't mean incredible in a good way. I mean just incredible in the most shocking and negative way possible. The amount of restrictions people have on their speech, on their property, it's just incredible. It's almost like it's not even really yours anymore because the state can just take it away at a whim. And things aren't as bad in the United States as they are in places like, excuse me, the UK and Germany, but I do fear that's where we're headed. So
And do you think it has something to do with the fact that they conceded huge ground in justifying the existence of a state in the first place? It's like, all right, you guys have a monopoly on violence within this geographical area. You have the right to tax, you have the right to regulate, but don't do it too much. You're going to have to go through Congress and then get the president to sign off on it. You'll have the right to establish a central bank, and you have the right to conscript soldiers, but only if it's an emergency, only for the public interest. You think allowing all those things created such a green light that almost anyone, if I would be scared to have that power if I were given it tomorrow. I can already hear myself rationalizing, well, I'm only supporting this limited strike against Venezuela because if I wasn't in here, the neocons would be, and they would go, completely scorched earth on it. So really, I'm helping out. I can already see myself facing those incentives with that amount of power, rationalizing totally unjustifiable things. Imagine if you had access to $6 trillion every year for the next 4 years. That would be so difficult to restrain yourself in doing. So I think basically because people didn't apply the concept of the non-aggression principle consistently, and basically, yes, embrace anarcho-capitalism ideologically or explicitly, that you're really creating this big gaping hole for any tyranny to come about. I mean, to give the state this blank check with a monopoly on violence, it's amazing we only had one civil war with 600,000 deaths. Uh, so, do you think that sort of lies at the root of the problem? The fact that we said, "We're gonna give you a monopoly on violence, we're gonna give you all this power, and then the people are gonna keep a close eye on you, so behave yourselves."
Well, Keith, it's tough. I mean, one of the articles I wrote earlier this year for the Mises Institute actually was about the failure of constitutions through the ages, because the liberals had a program for defending liberty, and it was called constitutionalism. And it was this belief that if we wrote down a very narrow prescription of what the government can do, that will ensure our liberty. Constitutionalism has failed. And it was always kind of obvious that it would eventually. And it started failing almost immediately. And for two reasons. Number one, who is going to interpret whether or not a thing is constitutional? Oh, government courts. Okay, strike one. Number two, right away, again, there's trouble immediately, was this idea that there are implied powers. Well, golly, Keith, if it tells us to do something, if it says the government can do something, surely it means that whatever necessary or convenient things are, we can just have other things if we need them. If it would be convenient to have a central bank to affect these other things, then of course we can have one. And right away, it was war. It was war. The opposition to the central bank and all the different things, like even people like Madison and Jefferson after the War of 1812 were like, yeah, maybe we do need one of those. For what? For war, for the purposes of war. And it's really, I do think that the failure of liberalism in America is such a shame, because the Articles of Confederation, there'd have been nothing wrong with those. The United States was born. Look, I don't think liberalism can work everywhere simply because of the intensely competitive nature of the geopolitics of the state system, right? So if you're a state that lives in a rough neighborhood, like Poland historically, right, living right between Germany and Russia, that's, you know, probably not going to work there. But the United States was born into the most benign security environment in the history of the world. Weak and divided neighbors to the west, weak neighbor to the north, weak neighbors to the south. There was no need to have a large standing army or navy or anything like that. Um, gosh, and once you have those things, once you have things like debt and standing armies, I mean, those are the known instruments of tyranny, right? To paraphrase James Madison. So it's hard to know really where to point where, like, hey, it was this one thing that went wrong. I definitely feel like constitutionalism as an idea was just kind of basically flawed from the outset. if you just thought it through, like, and so, and I look at historical examples of like decent Republican systems that like worked pretty well and how long they lasted. I just look at some of the safeguards that they put in place. And I look at what happened in the United States, which rapidly democratized. And I just don't think democracy produces phenomenal leaders as a rule, because it tends to as the franchise expands. I think it panders to the least common denominator, right? I look at things like the Venetian Republic. What did they do? Okay, so they had, if you were a property owner or a guild member, that meant you were like a skilled artisan or something, right? They'd put all your names into a drum, and then they'd pull names out randomly. And okay, Keith, you are a senator this year. You have no choice in the matter. You are not allowed to decline it. Doesn't matter if you have pressing business to attend to. You have to. You are not allowed to live with your family or your friends. You have to go live in this special secluded compound with the other senators for the year. You are not allowed to go meet with foreigners from outside the city. You have to speak so as to always be able to be overheard. Like, you can't have private conversations. Like, the understanding was, look, these guys have power. We need to watch them like hawks. And I look at our own system and it's like, number one, you have people campaigning. That's never good. You should never give power to someone who wants it. That's like the worst kind of person to give it to. Number two, they can just have the power forever. And there's very little transparency at all. So I just think, man, the Venetian Republic lasted a few hundred years before it essentially became an oligopoly, an oligarchy. Um, let's see, we fully democratized, basically within the last century. Uh, and we've basically already got like an imperial presidency, right? Like, Congress is just there to keep passing continuing resolutions. They don't they don't make important decisions, and they don't want to. And so that's something that I look at too, is people complain about courts legislating. Like, oh, these judges keep legislating from the bench. And it's like, well, Congress could just pass laws, but that requires work and risk to their position, so they're not going to do that. And oh, the president, so many executive orders. It's like, well, again, Congress could do things, but it's easier to just say, well, the president did it. What can little old me do? Except bring
My
home
hands are
a piece
tied.
of
Yeah.
pie, for my district. So
So, on one hand, we have the incentives of the politicians who get the power and they have every incentive to reap benefits to themselves. On the other side of the coin is the incentives that the voters face. So, I could maybe get some legislation passed if, I don't do what I had planned today and I instead call all my friends and talk to them about one of the many hundreds of pieces of legislation. We could all take off work for a few weeks, go down to the state capitol. Maybe we could take a flight to DC. That's going to take a long time. We got to read the bills. We got to shake a lot of hands. We got to ask people running for Congress, where do they stand? And then we got to look into their reputation, make sure they're a good, honest, virtuous person. And that'll take, what, 10 years for us to maybe get a good hold on agricultural subsidies, maybe the minimum wage. And then maybe people will listen to us if we dedicate the next decade of our lives to this thing. Meanwhile, I would be 40 years old and 10 years closer to death. And there's a maybe 1% chance that I would change the terrible socialism of the left and right and bring it into the direction of anarcho capitalism. So it's not just the incentives of the politicians, it's the lack of incentives among the voters to actually get things to change. I see this as another huge flaw in the concept that, well, if we have voters, they'll keep the politicians on their heels.
well, Keith, you really nailed it on the head there. And I'm actually teaching my econ course tonight. And I treat it kind of like a political economy course. And I'm always trying to impress upon them the importance of thinking in terms of diffuse costs spread out among all of us, and the highly concentrated benefits. And I love that you picked agricultural subsidies because that's what I always start by using as an example. Look, there's only a handful of very large farmers and agribusinesses who benefit from the US government's agricultural policy. This policy is worth $1 billion a year to these people. So your slice of that is at minimum like $1 million. How hard are you going to fight for $1 million a year? You're going to fight like a dog, right? You're not going to quit that for anything. Whereas what does it cost you and me? Buck a month, maybe? Buck a
Yeah.
month? Like you said, what are we going to do? Form a political action committee? Quit our jobs? Rally the people against this? Like, and again, it's obvious when you sit down and talk to a room of people and you say, "Hey, how come sugar is $6 a pound?" That doesn't make a whole lot of sense, does it? And then you explain that the government has price floors and deliberately is trying to constrain supply to keep agricultural prices high, right? So people understand this, but again, the actual cost of them is so small, and they have so many other things going on in their lives. It's more important for them to get that psychic benefit that you mentioned, right? To just have a team and cheer passionately for them. Politics, who was it that said politics is the entertainment front of the military industrial complex? I
Oh,
forget. Someone said it and it
is
was
that a
like, oh, that's
PJ
so funny.
O'Rourke?
Oh, that's so funny. It's so true. Like, yes, they fight on the edges of about social issues and things like that. And it's not that those things aren't important, but neither one of them are touching the basic fundamental architecture of the state, its cronyism, its subsidies, all of its many recipients of patronage, whether it be government contracts or whatever the case may be. There's very little financial cost that people can see, and again, it's hard to get people to think in terms of like long term, right? Like, okay, if each of these policies costs you all together, if all the silly government policies cost you $2 a day, it's hard to get people to see how that can compound. And if you had put it in an S&P 500 index fund and just reinvested, it'd be $1 million or whatever. It's hard to get people to think in those terms. It's much easier for them to just say, I just hate Obama and those Democrats. Oh, they're just ruining the country. Oh, I just hate Trump and those Republicans. They're just ruining the country. And then they turn on their particular brand of sportscaster, whether it be Fox or MSNBC, and they just get to sit there after a long, hard day and hear about how really all their troubles are because of the other team's fault. And if only our team had power. Yeah, I mean, Mises recognized this. There's so much literature on like political behavior now that shows that voters are rationally irrational about stuff because the actual cost to them of being super knowledgeable and educated is very high. The impact of their single vote is immeasurably small. And so it's rational for them to throw all that reasoning out the window and just pick a team and cheer for them and enjoy the psychic benefit that accrues to you from enjoying your team's victories and hating the other team passionately. So,
All right, and I have to disagree with you about Poland. When it comes to, say, Poland in 1939, and they're under the Pilsudski regime, and General Beck is refusing to either lower the customs on the free city of Danzig or negotiate or hold a referendum for the people of Danzig, having a very powerful government that came into existence as a result of a coup in 1926. This very powerful state ended up resulting in a war over this land that killed, I think, according to the World War II Museum, 5.6 million people, destroyed all the major cities, left millions more homeless and destitute. There was a famine in Warsaw for the next 6 years. And this was when their population was like 35 million. So imagine if they had embraced anarcho capitalism And those were the results they got. Well, those are still the results they got when they had a very strong executive, which Curtis Yarvin, I'm sure, will brag about. Pilsudski's regime being very strong in the executive. So they were really worried about the long term well being of the state. And that's what it's led to. It, of course, is difficult because we can't go back in time and run the counterfactual and then compare the two. But I think even in the example of something like Poland, if I'm Stalin in the East and Hitler in the West, I think it would be very beneficial for me to just have to take out one regime that has a monopoly on violence, then I'm the monopolist. Whereas if there's no recognized monopoly, oh my gosh, I got to get troops all around this place and then violently enforce my rule. And people in this area don't accept the legitimacy of state rule. But if I could just get a hold of Warsaw or some of those major capitals, then the people who believe in a monopoly, if I take out that monopoly, then I'm the new violent monopolist in the neighborhood. Are you open to saying even the
You know,
concept of
I think
voluntarism could apply to
no,
Poland
I think it's
even in
awesome.
1939?
I think it's awesome that you brought that up because I hadn't been thinking about the opposite situation, which is where you do have a strong state with a monopoly on violence, which Poland had in the interwar period. I had been thinking of Poland historically, like in the 17th century and the 18th century, when it was like almost anarchy. There was a constitutional monarchy in Poland, but it was so weak that any member of the Congress, when they got together to discuss business, any one of them, they had what was called the liberum veto, which meant we're all 500 of us are discussing the situation. We've got 499 votes that all agree, like, yes, this would be a good idea. A single dude could be like, no, I hate this idea, and then everyone would have to go home. And it was referred to as constitutional anarchy. And eventually it led to Poland being divided up among its three more centralized, powerful neighbors: Prussia, Russia, and Austria. And these were the partitions of Poland that destroyed Poland. When Poland, in terms of population size, power, like, if it had been coordinated, probably could have fended them off. Maybe not. I mean, maybe it still, like you said, maybe it still wouldn't have mattered. But that's an interesting case study because we have almost an anarchic Poland and a statist Poland example. And in both cases, they were conquered and divided up by basically Germany and Russia. So that's interesting. I had not thought about it from the standpoint of the 20th century. Worth
What
looking
was
at.
the death what was the death toll in the 1700s? Is it, but
Oh
I don't believe,
gosh,
could it have been a fifth of the population as
no,
most
no,
historians estimate? Did,
no. They no,
okay.
no. It was nothing like that. No, I doubt there were 100,000 casualties in all the partitions. Maybe not even. Maybe that's even high.
All right.
It
So
was critical to the
even,
birth of the American
yeah.
Revolution, though. I will say that.
See, that's what you get at the Libertarian Institute. We at least we have no problem disagreeing with each other, and we can still talk it out in public. The books, but remind me of the title: Classical Liberalism: The Birth and Death of an Idea. Check it out at libertarianinstitute.org. Joe Solis-Mullins, Ralph Raico, fellow at the Libertarian Institute. Thanks so much for your time, brother.
Thanks for having me, Keith. It's always a pleasure.